The metallic taste of fear hung thick in the tropical air as General Tomoyuki Yamashita peered through his field glasses at the distant horizon where American warships dotted the sea like deadly steel islands. It was the morning of January 9th, 1945, and the largest Pacific campaign since Guadalcanal was about to begin on the shores of Luzon, the Philippines' most strategic island. Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya for his lightning conquest of Singapore 3 years earlier, now found himself in an impossible position. His forces, numbering approximately 275,000 men, were spread across Luzon's rugged terrain, tasked with defending an island larger than Cuba against what intelligence reports suggested would be the most massive amphibious assault in Pacific theater history. The morning mist clung to the beaches of Lingayen Gulf. As American landing craft approached the shoreline, General Douglas MacArthur stood aboard the USS Boise, his weathered face set in grim determination. This was more than a military campaign for MacArthur, it was personal redemption. 3 years earlier, he had been forced to flee these same islands, leaving behind thousands of American and Filipino troops to face the brutal Bataan Death March. Now, with the combined might of the 6th Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger and the 8th Army under Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, MacArthur intended to fulfill his famous promise, "I shall return." The first shells began falling at dawn, a thunderous barrage from Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment fleet that shook the very foundations of the coastal defenses. Palm trees exploded into splinters, and concrete bunkers crumbled under the relentless pounding of 16-inch naval guns. Yet Yamashita had learned from the costly mistakes of other Pacific Island defenses. Rather than concentrating his forces on the beaches, where they would be vulnerable to overwhelming firepower, he had withdrawn the bulk of his troops into the mountainous interior, planning to bleed the Americans white in a war of attrition among Luzon's treacherous peaks and valleys. As the landing craft hit the beaches, American soldiers of the 6th Corps poured onto Philippine soil with a mixture of determination and trepidation. Staff Sergeant James Morrison of the 1st Battalion, 182nd Infantry Regiment, later recalled the surreal quiet that greeted their arrival. "We expected hell on earth," he remembered, but the beaches were almost eerily calm. It was like walking into a trap that hadn't been sprung yet. The lack of immediate resistance was deceiving. Yamashita's strategy was far more sophisticated than a simple beach defense. He had divided his forces into 3 main groups: the Shobu Group in northern Luzon, with 152,000 men, the Kembu Group defending the Central Plains and Clark Field with 30,000 troops, and the Shimbu Group protecting Manila and southern Luzon with 80,000 soldiers. Each group was positioned to fight independently, forcing the Americans to wage multiple simultaneous campaigns across difficult terrain. By nightfall of January 9th, American forces had established a beachhead 20 miles wide and for miles deep, with surprisingly light casualties. General Kruger's men had landed over 68,000 troops and thousands of tons of equipment. But as the tropical darkness fell over Luzon, both commanders knew the real battle was just beginning. The Americans had won the easy part. Now they would have to fight their way across an island where every hill, every valley, and every town could become a fortress defended by an enemy who had already accepted death as the price of honor. The morning of January 10th brought with it the first taste of what Luzon would truly cost in American blood. As General Kruger's 6th Army pushed inland from their beachhead at Lingayen Gulf, they encountered not the mass resistance of desperate beach defenders, but something far more ominous: carefully prepared killing fields designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined zones of destruction. Major General Innes Swift's 1st Corps advanced toward the strategic town of San Fabian, expecting to encounter scattered resistance. Instead, his lead elements walked into a meticulously planned ambush. Japanese artillery, hidden in the hills overlooking the coastal plain, erupted with devastating precision. The 43rd Infantry Division found themselves pinned down in rice paddies that offered no cover, while mortar rounds fell among them with mechanical regularity. Captain Robert Chen of the 124th Infantry Regiment watched in horror as his company was cut to pieces in the first hour of the advance. "They had our range calculated to the yard," he later reported. "Every time we tried to move, they dropped shells exactly where we were going to be. It was like they could read our minds." The Americans were learning their first harsh lesson about fighting. Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, had not earned his reputation through luck. Meanwhile, the 14th Corps under Major General Oscar Griswold was discovering that the Japanese had turned every Filipino town into a fortress. As they approached Demortis, scouts reported that the seemingly peaceful village ahead was actually a warren of interconnected bunkers and fighting positions. Every house had been converted into a strong point, every street had been blocked and mined, and every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. According to a detailed analysis published in the Army Historical Foundation's archives, the Japanese defense of Luzon represented a revolutionary approach to island warfare that would influence military thinking for decades to come, rather than attempting to hold fixed positions at all costs. Yamashita's forces employed what modern military theorists would recognize as defense in depth, using the island's natural terrain to maximize casualties while preserving their fighting force. The fighting in Demortis lasted 3 days and cost the Americans over 400 casualties. Technical Sergeant William Rodriguez of the 37th Infantry Division described the urban combat as worse than anything we faced in New Guinea. At least in the jungle, you could see where the enemy might be hiding. Here, death could come from any window, any door, any pile of rubble. But it was the advanced Ward Clark Field that truly demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese defensive planning. The airfield, crucial to American air operations in the Philippines, was defended by Major General Rikichi Sukata's Kembu Group. Sukata had spent months transforming the flat terrain around Clark into a network of mutually supporting positions connected by underground tunnels. American intelligence had completely underestimated both the strength of the defenses and the determination of their defenders. On January 23rd, the 40th Infantry Division launched what they believed would be a straightforward assault on the airfield. Instead, they found themselves attacking positions that seemed to regenerate like a hydra. Every bunker destroyed was immediately reoccupied from underground passages. Every hill captured was subjected to counterattacks from tunnels that honeycombed the earth beneath their feet. We'd clear a position in the morning, and by afternoon, there would be Japs shooting at us from the same spot. It was like fighting ghosts. The Americans were learning that conventional tactics developed for European warfare were inadequate for the unique challenges of Pacific Island fighting. As January drew to a close, American casualties were mounting far faster than anyone had anticipated. General MacArthur, under pressure from Washington to accelerate the campaign, began pushing his field commanders to take greater risks. The stage was being set for some of the bloodiest fighting in Pacific theater history. February 19, 1945, marked the beginning of what would become known as the Manila Massacre, though American forces approaching the Philippine capital had no idea they were walking into one of the war's most horrific urban battles. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding the Manila Naval Defense Force with approximately 17,000 men, had decided to ignore General Yamashita's orders to evacuate the city and instead transform it into a fortress that would consume American lives by the thousands. Major General Robert Baylor's 37th Infantry Division was the first to encounter the true nature of Manila's defenses as they approached from the north. The Japanese had spent weeks preparing the city for siege warfare, converting massive stone buildings into individual fortresses, mining bridges and key intersections, and positioning naval guns in locations where they could sweep the major thoroughfares. With devastating fire, the battle for Manila began with deceptive ease. As American forces advanced through the northern suburbs, Filipino civilians, many of whom had been hiding in their homes for weeks, emerged to greet their liberators with tears of joy and offerings of what little food they had preserved. But this jubilation quickly turned to horror as Japanese forces began implementing what can only be described as a deliberate campaign of civilian extermination. Captain James Sullivan of the 1st Battalion, 129th Infantry Regiment, witnessed atrocities that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We found them in the old Spanish churches, hundreds of women and children who had sought sanctuary. The Japanese had barricaded the doors and set the buildings on fire. The smell, God help me, I could still smell it 50 years later. The fighting intensified dramatically when American forces reached the Pasig River, which divided Manila into northern and southern sections. Every bridge had been destroyed, and Japanese naval guns commanded all the likely crossing points. The Americans found themselves engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting reminiscent of Stalingrad, with each city block becoming a separate battlefield where progress was measured in yards rather than miles. Technical details of the urban warfare tactics employed during the Manila campaign, as documented in the official U.S. Army Center of Military History records, revealed the innovative approaches American forces developed to cope with fighting. In a densely populated city, tank infantry teams learned to use demolition charges to blast through building walls. rather than exposing themselves in the streets. The battle for the Philippine General Hospital illustrated the savage nature of the fighting. Japanese forces had converted the 7-story medical facility into a fortress, with patients and medical staff trapped inside as human shields. Major Thomas Anderson led a company of engineers in a week-long assault that required clearing the building floor by floor, room by room, often while Japanese defenders detonated grenades in crowded wards filled with helpless patients. "We had to make impossible choices," Anderson later recalled. "Do you throw grenades into wards where Japanese soldiers are hiding among hospital beds?" There were no good answers, only necessary ones. The moral complexity of urban warfare was forcing American soldiers to confront ethical dilemmas for which their training had not prepared them. By February 25th, American forces controlled most of northern Manila, but the southern districts remained in Japanese hands. Admiral Iwabuchi had consolidated his remaining forces in the historic Intramuros district, the ancient walled city built by Spanish colonizers centuries earlier. The medieval fortifications, constructed to withstand cannon fire, proved remarkably effective against modern weapons. American artillery shells that could destroy Japanese bunkers on Pacific Islands merely chipped away at walls that were 20 feet thick in places. The civilian population trapped in Intramuros faced an impossible situation. While American artillery bombardments were destroying entire city blocks, the liberation the Americans had promised was turning into a nightmare that would scar the Philippine capital for generations. March 1st, 1945, found American forces facing their greatest tactical challenge yet as they attempted to break through the Kembu Line, the sophisticated defensive network protecting Clark Field and the central Luzon plains. Major General Rikichi Sukata had spent months transforming what appeared to be open agricultural land into a killing field where every farm building, every irrigation ditch, and every stand of bamboo concealed prepared fighting positions. The assault began at dawn with the most intensive artillery barrage yet employed in the Philippines campaign. Over 300 guns from the 6th Army's artillery battalions poured shells into suspected Japanese positions for 2 hours, turning the peaceful rice paddies into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. Colonel James Morrison, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 106th 1st Infantry Regiment, watched the barrage with satisfaction, believing that nothing could survive such devastation. He was wrong, as his men advanced across the open ground toward their objectives. Japanese positions that should have been obliterated erupted with machine gun fire. Sukata's engineers had constructed their bunkers with overhead cover capable of withstanding direct hits from 155mm shells, while interconnecting trenches allowed defenders to pop up in unexpected locations to rake advancing Americans with deadly crossfire. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of Baker Company found himself pinned down in a drainage ditch, barely 2 feet deep, with Japanese bullets snapping overhead like angry hornets. They had us zeroed in from 3 different directions. He later reported, "Every time someone tried to move, they got cut down. We lay there for 6 hours, listening to our wounded buddies calling for medics who couldn't reach them." The carefully planned advance had become a static nightmare, reminiscent of World War I trench warfare. The breakthrough finally came through the innovative tactics of Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, commanding the 2nd Battalion. Recognizing that conventional frontal assaults were suicidal, Chen organized small infiltration teams equipped with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Working under cover of darkness, these teams crawled through irrigation ditches to approach Japanese positions from unexpected angles. The technique required extraordinary courage from soldiers who knew they were likely to die in the attempt. Private First Class Robert Martinez volunteered for one of the first infiltration missions, despite knowing that the previous 3 attempts had ended with the entire team being killed or captured. Somebody had to do it, he explained years later. Our guys were dying out there in that field, and we couldn't just leave them. Martinez's team successfully destroyed the machine gun nests, creating a gap that allowed the battalion to advance 300 yards before dawn. According to military analysts, whose work appears in the Journal of Military History, the Kembu Line fighting represented a tactical evolution in Pacific warfare that would influence American military doctrine well into the Cold War era. The integration of small unit tactics with heavy weapon support, pioneered during the Luzon campaign, became the foundation for modern combined arms warfare. But individual heroics and tactical innovation could only accomplish so much against prepared defenses manned by fanatic troops. The Japanese soldiers of the Kembu Group had been indoctrinated with the belief that death in battle was preferable to the shame of surrender. They fought with a desperate ferocity that stunned even veteran American troops. who had already experienced the horrors of Guadalcanal and Saipan. Captain William Rodriguez witnessed this fanaticism firsthand during the assault on Hill 265, a strategic height that commanded the approaches to Clark Field. His company had fought for 3 days to capture the hill, suffering 60% casualties in the process. As they finally overran the Japanese positions, Rodriguez expected to find survivors willing to surrender. Instead, he found that the last defending soldiers had detonated grenades rather than face capture, taking several Americans with them in their final moments. The psychological toll of such fighting began to show in increased cases of what military psychiatrists euphemistically termed battle fatigue. Men who had fought bravely through previous campaigns found themselves unable to function. When faced with an enemy that seemed to welcome death, the medical corps reported a sharp increase in requests for psychiatric evaluation, though most soldiers suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder remained at their posts out of loyalty to their comrades. By March 15th, American forces had finally broken through the main Kembu line, but at a cost that shocked even hardened commanders. The 40th Infantry Division alone had suffered over 3,000 casualties, including 800 dead. In 2 weeks of fighting, Clark Field was finally in American hands. But the victory had come at a price that raised serious questions about the sustainability of such tactics against a determined enemy willing to die for every yard of ground. April 10, 1945, marked the beginning of the final phase of the Luzon campaign as American forces prepared to assault General Yamashita's final stronghold in the mountainous region of northern Luzon. The Tiger of Malaya had withdrawn his remaining forces, approximately 100,000 men of the Shobu group, into terrain so rugged that conventional military wisdom suggested it was nearly impregnable. Lieutenant General Walter Kruger faced a tactical problem, unlike any he had encountered in his long military career. The mountains of northern Luzon rose to heights of over 8,000 feet, covered in dense tropical forests and cut by deep ravines that could hide entire battalions. Japanese engineers had spent months preparing these positions, turning natural caves into ammunition depots and constructing bunkers so well camouflaged that they remained invisible until their guns opened fire. The assault began with the 3rd and 2nd Infantry Division attacking along the Villa Verde Trail, a narrow mountain path that had been the only route through the region since Spanish colonial times. Colonel Robert Harrison, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 126th Infantry Regiment, quickly discovered that his maps were virtually useless in terrain where landmarks changed constantly due to Japanese demolitions and natural landslides triggered by the heavy rains of the approaching monsoon season. "We weren't fighting an army anymore," Harrison later wrote in his after-action report. "We were fighting the mountain itself with Japanese soldiers who seemed to appear out of solid rock." The Americans found themselves engaged in a form of warfare that was part conventional military operation and part mountaineering expedition, with soldiers carrying not only their weapons and ammunition, but also ropes, climbing equipment, and survival gear necessary for operations at high altitude. The fighting took on an almost prehistoric quality, as small units engaged in deadly games of hide-and-seek among the peaks and valleys. Japanese snipers, hidden in caves hundreds of feet above American positions, could pick off individual soldiers with impunity while remaining virtually impossible to locate and neutralize. American artillery, so effective in the coastal plains, proved largely useless in mountains where shells either burst harmlessly against rock faces or disappeared into deep ravines without effect. Detailed analysis from the U.S. Army War College's Historical Archives reveals that the northern Luzon fighting required American forces to develop entirely new tactical doctrines for mountain warfare. Small unit leaders learned to navigate by compass and intuition rather than relying on maps, while supply operations required the extensive use of pack mules and, eventually, helicopter drops when the terrain proved too difficult even for pack animals. Private First Class Tommy Chen of the 2nd Battalion, 127th Infantry Regiment, experienced the surreal nature of mountain combat during the battle for Hill 437. His squad spent for days climbing what appeared to be an undefended peak, only to discover at the summit that they were surrounded by Japanese positions hidden in caves they had walked past without noticing. "It was like being in a nightmare," Chen recalled. "We could hear them talking and moving around, but we couldn't see them. They could have killed us all a dozen times during our climb. But they waited until we were trapped on the summit with nowhere to run. Then they started picking us off one by one." Chen was one of only two survivors from his 12-man squad. saved only when American artillery finally located the hidden positions and collapsed several caves with direct hits. The psychological strain of mountain warfare proved even more debilitating than the physical challenges. Soldiers who had shown remarkable courage in conventional battles found themselves paralyzed by the constant awareness that death could come from any direction without warning. The dense forest canopy blocked radio communications, isolating small units for days at a time and creating a sense of abandonment that led to increasing incidents of what military psychiatrists termed combat exhaustion. Major William Sullivan, serving as a battalion surgeon with the 25th Infantry Division, reported treating soldiers for conditions he had never encountered in medical school. Men would come to me claiming they couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't move their arms or legs, but there was nothing physically wrong with them. They had simply reached the breaking point of human endurance. The human mind wasn't designed to function under such constant, invisible threat. By the end of April, American casualties in the mountain fighting had reached levels that alarmed even General MacArthur, who was under increasing pressure from Washington to conclude the Philippines campaign quickly so half forces could be redeployed for the planned invasion of Japan. Yet Yamashita's forces showed no signs of weakening, and intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese general was prepared to fight indefinitely. In his mountain fortress, the stage was set for a final, desperate gamble that would determine whether the Americans could afford to continue the grinding mountain warfare, or would be forced to adopt entirely different tactics to bring the Philippine campaign to an end. May 15, 1945, brought news that would transform the entire strategic situation in the Philippines. Germany had surrendered, and the full weight of Allied resources could now be concentrated against Japan. For General MacArthur, this meant access to new weapons and tactics that might break the stalemate in the northern Luzon mountains without requiring the massive casualties that conventional assault would demand. The weapon that would change everything was the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in the American arsenal. Until now, the mountainous terrain had made it impossible to effectively employ strategic bombers against Yamashita's positions. The peaks and valleys created wind patterns that made precision bombing nearly impossible. While the thick forest canopy concealed targets from aerial observation, Colonel Curtis E. Lemme, commanding the 21st Bomber Command, proposed a radical solution. Instead of trying to target individual positions, American bombers would carpet bomb entire mountain valleys, using a combination of high explosive and incendiary bombs to create firestorms that would consume the forest cover and expose hidden Japanese positions to follow-up attacks by ground forces. The first experimental raid took place on May 20th against a valley system known to contain major Japanese supply depots. 36 B-29 bombers dropped over 100 tons of bombs in a pattern designed to ignite a firestorm that would spread through the entire valley. The results exceeded all expectations. Secondary explosions from ammunition dumps continued for 3 days, while the fire burned for over a week, consuming an estimated 10 square miles of forest. Major General Charles Hall, commanding the 1st Corps, watched the bombing from an observation post 15 miles away and was awed by the destructive power unleashed against Yamashita's positions. It looked like the end of the world. He later wrote, "The entire mountain range was covered in smoke, and we could feel the heat from the fires even at our distance. Nothing could survive in that inferno." But Yamashita proved once again why he was called the Tiger of Malaya. Rather than being destroyed by the firestorms, his forces adapted to the new tactical situation with remarkable speed and flexibility. Japanese engineers had prepared alternate supply routes through cave systems that remained largely unaffected by surface bombing, while combat units learned to take shelter in deep caves during bombing raids and emerge afterward to reoccupy positions that appeared destroyed, but were actually still functional. The effectiveness of Japanese adaptation became clear during the Battle of Salksak Pass. On June 1st, American forces, believing that the area had been cleared by carpet bombing, advanced with minimal reconnaissance only to find themselves facing resistance as fierce as anything they had encountered in the campaign. Staff Sergeant Robert Morrison of the 3rd Battalion, 161st Infantry Regiment, led his squad into what appeared to be a bombed-out wasteland, only to discover that Japanese machine gunners were firing from positions excavated from beneath. Tons of bomb debris. Research conducted by the Army Historical Foundation and published in their comprehensive study of Pacific theater operations reveals that the Luzon campaign had by this point evolved into something unprecedented in military history, a test of whether modern industrial warfare could overcome traditional military virtues of courage, determination, and tactical skill applied in favorable terrain. The human cost of this testing was becoming unbearable. American casualties for the entire Philippines campaign had reached over 62,000, including 14,000 dead. Many units were operating at 50% strength or less, with replacement soldiers arriving from the United States having to be thrown into combat with minimal training in the specific conditions they would face in the Philippine mountains. Captain David Chen, commanding what remained of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 126th Infantry Regiment, found himself leading men who had been civilians 6 months earlier against Japanese veterans, who had been fighting for 8 years. It wasn't fair to either side, he reflected years later. My kids were brave enough, but they didn't know how to read terrain, how to spot camouflage positions, how to move quietly through jungle. The Japanese killed them almost casually, like a professional boxer fighting amateurs. Yet even as casualties mounted and the tactical situation remained deadlocked, larger strategic events were moving toward a conclusion that would make the continuing sacrifice in the Philippine mountains irrelevant. In laboratories and test sites thousands of miles away, American scientists were putting the finishing touches on a weapon that would end the war, without requiring the invasion of Japan that the Philippines campaign was supposed to support. The irony was lost on the soldiers dying in the mountains of Luzon, but the battles they were fighting with such courage and determination were already becoming footnotes to a larger story that would be written in atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Tiger of Malaya would continue his resistance until the very end, but the end was approaching faster than anyone on either side could have imagined. August 15, 1945, brought Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement crackling over field radios throughout the mountains of northern Luzon. But for the exhausted American soldiers still fighting in the rugged terrain, the news seemed almost surreal. After 8 months of continuous combat, the idea that the war could simply end with a radio broadcast struck many as impossible to comprehend. General Yamashita, monitoring American communications from his command post hidden deep in the mountains near Kiangin, faced the most difficult decision of his military career. The Emperor's surrender order was clear and unambiguous. Yet Yamashita commanded nearly 60,000 troops who remained capable of effective resistance, and who had been indoctrinated to believe that surrender was worse than death. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, now commanding what remained of the 1st Battalion, 126th Infantry Regiment, received the ceasefire order with a mixture of relief and disbelief. His unit had been reduced to fewer than 200 effectives from an original strength of over 800. And they were preparing for what everyone expected to be another month of bloody mountain warfare. The silence was the strangest thing, Harrison later recalled. For 8 months, there hadn't been a single day without the sound of gunfire, artillery, or aircraft. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The jungle sounds that we hadn't heard over the noise of war came flooding back, birds, insects, monkeys. It was like the world was waking up from a terrible nightmare. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. But the practical business of ending the war in the Philippines proved far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Many Japanese units in remote mountain positions had not received surrender orders, while others received the orders but chose to ignore them, preferring death to the shame of capitulation. Major General William Chase, commanding the 38th Infantry Division, found himself responsible for disarming Japanese units that remained fully capable of resistance and showed little inclination to cooperate with surrender procedures. American soldiers who had spent months learning to kill Japanese troops now had to learn the even more difficult skill of treating them as defeated enemies worthy of respect rather than extermination. The process was complicated by the presence of an estimated 50,000 Filipino guerrilla fighters who had suffered under Japanese occupation for over 3 years and saw no reason to show mercy to their tormentors simply because Emperor Hirohito had decided to surrender. Captain Robert Sullivan found himself protecting Japanese prisoners from Filipino civilians who had lost family members to Japanese atrocities and demanded revenge. We had to explain to people who had watched their children bayoneted by Japanese soldiers that these same soldiers were now under American protection, Sullivan remembered. It was probably the hardest thing I ever had to do as an officer. How do you ask a father who lost his family to forgive and forget? How do you tell a woman who was brutalized that her attackers deserve to live? Statistical analysis compiled by the Army Center of Military History reveals the staggering cost of the Luzon campaign. American forces suffered over 38,000 casualties, including 8,200 dead, while Japanese losses exceeded 100,000 killed and 9,000 captured. Filipino civilian casualties, impossible to calculate precisely due to the widespread destruction of records, probably exceeded 100,000. Yet beyond the statistics lay stories of individual courage and sacrifice that would resonate through military history. Technical Sergeant John Martinez, who had volunteered for 17 separate infiltration missions behind Japanese lines, survived the war only to discover that his hometown sweetheart had married someone else after receiving notification that he was missing in action. Private First Class William O'Brien, who had saved 6 wounded comrades during the fighting at Clark Field, returned home to find that his father's small business had failed during his absence, and the family farm had been foreclosed. General Yamashita himself surrendered formally on September 3, 1945, in a ceremony that marked the end of organized Japanese resistance in the Philippines. The Tiger of Malaya, who had once seemed invincible as he conquered Singapore and Malaya in a matter of weeks, now appeared as a tired, defeated old man who had fought courageously against impossible odds and lost everything except his honor. The final irony of the Philippines campaign became clear in the years that followed. The invasion of Japan, which the Luzon fighting had been designed to support, never took place, meaning that the tens of thousands of Americans who died in the Philippine mountains had given their lives for a strategic objective that was ultimately achieved through entirely different means. But for the survivors, the meaning of their sacrifice transcended strategic calculations. They had proven that American soldiers could match Japanese fanaticism with their own form of courage, that democratic values could triumph over militant nationalism, and that citizen soldiers could endure hardships that would have broken professional armies of earlier eras. The Battle of Luzon had been won not through superior weapons or tactics, but through the simple determination of young Americans who refused to quit, when quitting would have been understandable and perhaps even sensible. The mountains of northern Luzon still bear scars from the fighting that ended over 75 years ago, and Filipino farmers occasionally unearth rusted weapons and equipment from battles that most of the world has forgotten. But for those who served, the memories remain as sharp as they were on that August morning when the guns finally fell silent, and the longest campaign in Pacific theater history came to an end.